Dean Harris had not had a day off in 3 weeks. Not a real one anyway. There had been a few gaps between assignments where technically nothing was scheduled but something always came up. A last-minute briefing, a equipment check that ran long, a situation that needed one more person and he happened to be standing nearby. That was just how it went in the Supply and Security Corps. The schedule was always one thing on paper and something else entirely in practice. But today was actually free. Confirmed free. His commanding officer had looked him in the eye that morning and said, "Go, don't come back until tomorrow, and don't be reachable unless something is actively on fire." So Dean had changed out of his uniform, grabbed his jacket, and taken the transit line down to the lower market district of Velos Prime with absolutely no plan beyond finding something cheap to eat and sitting somewhere that wasn't a base. Velos Prime was a trading hub. Had been for about 200 years by local reckoning. The kind of place that grew up fast around a good transit junction and never really got organized after that, just kept layering on top of itself until you had a city that was loud and dense and permanently crowded and somehow functional despite all evidence suggesting it shouldn't be. The lower market was the oldest part of it. Narrow lanes packed with vendor stalls selling everything from machine components to food to things that had no obvious category. The crowd was thick and mixed. A dozen different species moving in every direction at once, voices overlapping in 4 languages, the smell of cooking coming from 6 different directions simultaneously. Dean liked it. It was the kind of place where nobody looked at you twice because everyone was too busy doing their own thing. He found a small vendor near the middle of the main strip, pointed at something on the menu that looked like it might be a stew, paid for it without asking too many questions and found a low wall nearby to sit on. The bowl turned out to contain something hot and dense and honestly pretty good despite the fact that he had no idea what was in it. He ate slowly. Watched the crowd move. Let his brain go quiet for the first time in weeks. He was about halfway through when he heard it. It was a small sound. Easy to miss in all the noise, just a brief, sharp intake of breath. The kind of sound that didn't fit the general rhythm of market noise. Not a shout, not an argument, not the usual loud back and forth of vendors and customers. Something smaller and more specific than that. Frightened. He turned toward it automatically. Years of training do that to a person. You stop being able to hear certain sounds without your body reacting before your brain catches up. It was coming from the side alley off the main strip. Narrow, shadowed, the kind of space that exists in every busy market in the world. A gap between 2 vendor structures that people walk past without looking into. Dean looked into it. A Dravari child. Small, young enough that the characteristic silver patterns on Dravari skin were still faint and unformed the way they were in early childhood. She was pressed against the back wall of the alley with her arms pulled in tight to her body, the posture of someone who has made themselves as small as possible because small feels safer. She was alone. No adult nearby, no family visible, just a child who had clearly gotten separated from whoever she was supposed to be with and ended up in the worst possible place for it. Because the alley was not empty. 6 men. Spread in a loose formation across the width of the alley entrance. The way they were standing, the spacing, the positioning, the casual certainty of it, told Dean everything he needed to know about what kind of people they were. These weren't opportunists who had stumbled into a situation. They were organized. They moved like people who had done this kind of thing before and had long since stopped expecting anyone to interfere. Dean looked at the main strip behind him. The market kept moving. Vendors called out to customers. A group of Oresi merchants argued cheerfully over a price. 2 kids from some species he didn't recognize chased each other between the stalls. Life going on at full volume in every direction. Not one single person was looking at the alley. Some of them had to have seen it. The alley wasn't invisible. But there was a particular way people look away from things that are dangerous and not their problem. A practiced, deliberate kind of not seeing that Dean recognized instantly. Eyes that slide past without stopping. Bodies that angle slightly away. The universal body language of a crowd that has collectively decided that whatever is happening over there is not something they are going to get involved in. He understood it. He wasn't angry about it. People had their reasons and most of them were practical and real. He looked back at the alley. At the child pressed against the wall. At the 6 men who hadn't noticed him yet because they had no reason to think anyone was going to do anything. Dean set his bowl down on the wall beside him. Carefully so it didn't spill. He stood up. And he walked toward the alley. Dean walked into the alley without a plan. That was the honest truth of it. There was no strategy forming in his head, no tactical assessment, no calculation of odds. There was just a child against a wall and 6 men between him and her, and his feet were already moving before any of the more sensible parts of his brain had a chance to weigh in on the decision. He was off duty. Civilian clothes. No armor, no comm unit, no backup waiting anywhere nearby. The only thing he was carrying was the small blade he kept on his belt out of pure habit. The kind of habit that gets drilled into you after enough years in the Corps until it becomes automatic, like checking that your boots are tied before you leave a room. It was not a significant weapon. Against one person in a bad situation it was useful. Against 6 armed men in a narrow alley it was a comfort at best. He walked in anyway. The 6 men noticed him when he was about 10 feet away. They turned with the slow, unbothered confidence of people who were used to being the most dangerous thing in any given space and had learned through experience that nobody ever actually intervened. They looked at him the way you look at a minor inconvenience, briefly, with mild irritation, already expecting it to remove itself. Dean stopped walking when he was about 4 feet from the nearest one. Close enough to be clearly in the alley, clearly in the situation, clearly not passing through. He looked past them at the child. She was staring at him with enormous eyes, that specific expression kids get when something is happening that they don't understand and they are trying very hard to figure out if it is good or bad. Dean took one step to the side, positioning himself between her and the group. Then he said in a level and unhurried voice that they needed to walk away right now. The one closest to him smiled. Not a friendly smile. The kind of smile that meant he had heard this before and it had never once worked out for the person saying it. He said something back. Dean's translator caught about half of it. The general meaning was clear enough. There were 6 of them. There was one of him. He was carrying one small blade and he was wearing a jacket. The math was obvious and Dean should think very carefully about what he was doing before he made a choice he couldn't take back. Dean didn't move. He just stood there. Feet planted, shoulders square, the child behind him pressing herself against the wall. He kept his voice even and said it again, walk away. They didn't. What came next was not like anything shown in films or described in the kind of stories that get told afterward to make things sound cleaner than they were. It was fast and close and extremely painful, and the details are not something Dean would ever be able to recount in perfect sequence because that is not how the human body processes those kinds of moments. It files them in a different place. Fragmented. Out of order. What he knew was this: he did not move from in front of that child. That was the one constant throughout all of it. Whatever happened, whatever came at him, he absorbed it and stayed where he was because the moment he moved she was exposed, and that was the one outcome he was not going to allow. He took the first strike across his left arm and didn't go down. He took the second across his shoulder and stayed on his feet. He got his own blade out at some point and used it, though he couldn't have said exactly when. There were moments of clarity and moments that were just noise and pain and the effort of staying upright and keeping himself between them and her. At some point, he didn't know how long it had been, time had stopped working correctly, he heard voices from the alley entrance. Loud, official, the kind of controlled shouting that meant security response. The sound of boots. The specific energy shift that happens in a space when authority arrives and the people who were just in charge suddenly aren't anymore. The 6 men left. Quickly. The way people who know a location well disappear into it when they need to. And then it was quiet. Dean was on the ground. He wasn't sure exactly when that had happened. His back was against the alley wall, same wall the child had been pressed against when he first walked in. His jacket was heavy and wet in a way that jackets shouldn't be. The world had gone slightly dim at the edges, the particular dimness that arrives when your body has been running on emergency reserves and those reserves are almost gone. He turned his head. The child was there. Right beside him, pressed against the wall, arms pulled in tight to her body. She was looking at him with those same enormous eyes from before. She was not hurt. Not a mark on her. She was frightened and shaking and clearly didn't fully understand what had just happened, but she was completely, entirely unharmed. Dean looked at her for a second. Then he let out a long, slow breath and let his head fall back against the wall. The security team reached him about 30 seconds later. There was a lot of noise after that. Voices, equipment, someone pressing something firmly against his side that hurt significantly. He caught fragments of what they were saying to each other in clipped, urgent tones. He didn't try to respond to most of it. He was very tired suddenly. The medical report filed that evening at the Velos Prime Emergency Facility was 3 pages long. The summary section at the top listed 18 separate blade wounds distributed across his torso, both arms, and his left shoulder. Several were deep. 2 were close to things that mattered a great deal. The supervising physician noted in her report that the survival outcome was, in her professional assessment, unlikely given the volume and distribution of the injuries, and that the patient's continued presence among the living represented an outcome that was difficult to account for medically. He was alive. Just barely. But alive. Down the corridor from the treatment room, a small Dravari child sat in a chair next to an elderly woman who had arrived at the facility in tears and had not let go of the child's hand since. The child was wrapped in a blanket someone had brought her. She wasn't crying anymore. She kept looking down the corridor toward the room they had taken him into. Waiting, in the patient and total way that children wait when they have decided that something is important and they are not leaving until they know how it turns out. Nobody meant to leak it. That was the thing that came out later when people tried to trace where it started. It wasn't a coordinated release. It wasn't someone with an agenda trying to make a point. It was a Velos Prime market security worker named Pete, a tired, middle-aged man who had worked the surveillance desk for 11 years and had seen a lot of things on those feeds that he wished he hadn't, who watched the footage back during his end-of-shift review, sat completely still for a moment afterward, and then sent it to his brother on the other side of the station with a message that just said, "Watch this." His brother sent it to 4 people. Those 4 people sent it to others. By midnight it was on the main public networks. By the following morning it had crossed the first relay point out of the Velos system. By the end of the second day it was everywhere. 17 different surveillance angles. Some wide, showing the full alley entrance and the market strip beyond it. Some closer, from cameras mounted further down the alley that caught the detail more clearly. Taken together they told the whole story from beginning to end. The child alone against the wall, the 6 men, the moment a figure in a civilian jacket walked in from the main strip and placed himself between them. The footage was not easy to watch. Nobody who saw it described it that way. It was raw and close and real in the way that surveillance footage always is. No score, no framing, no edit to make it more digestible. Just exactly what happened from multiple angles in real time. What spread wasn't just the clip of Dean stepping into the alley. It was the full sequence. People watched the whole thing. Over and over, on screens across 14 star systems, hundreds of millions of people sat with it from the beginning. The child alone, the moment he heard something and turned, the moment he set his bowl down and stood up. That part. The bowl. That detail landed harder than anything else for reasons that were difficult to explain but almost universally felt. He set it down carefully. Not dropped, not thrown aside. Set down. Like he was planning to come back to it. Like it was just a brief interruption and he'd be back in a minute. It was such a small, ordinary gesture in the middle of something that was about to become the opposite of ordinary. People kept going back to that 2-second clip specifically. The bowl going down on the wall. The hands letting go of it. The body already turning. The responses coming in from across the galaxy were not uniform. Different species processed it differently and that in itself became part of the story. The Oresi, a species with a rigid social structure built around hierarchy and designated roles, found it genuinely confusing at first. The child was not his family. Not his species. Not his assigned responsibility under any framework they could identify. Several prominent Oresi commentators spent considerable time trying to find the angle, the hidden benefit, the political calculation, the social currency being earned. They couldn't find one. That confused them more. The Thessari reaction was quieter and more internal. In Thessari culture there was a concept that translated roughly as chosen burden, the idea of voluntarily taking on weight that wasn't yours to carry. It was considered a philosophical ideal, something discussed in ethics education and spiritual practice. Not something most people expected to see on a market surveillance feed on a Tuesday afternoon. Thessari forums went unusually still for a day, then filled up with very long and very serious conversations. Several smaller species had no framework for it at all. Not because the act was incomprehensible to them, they understood what had happened physically, but because the motivation sat outside any category their cultures had developed language for. Scholars started working on translations. Some of them said outright that their language simply didn't have a word for what they were watching and that this itself was worth examining. And then there were the species that just watched it in silence and didn't post anything and didn't say anything publicly, but the viewing numbers told their own story. The footage pulled back up again and again from the same accounts, watched multiple times, sometimes days after the initial spread when everything else had already moved on. On military bases across several systems, the footage circulated through mess halls and common rooms. Soldiers from a dozen different species watched it on shared screens without talking much. One commanding officer at a joint base in the outer corridor mentioned in a private message to a colleague that she had watched the whole thing 3 times and still wasn't entirely sure what she felt, but that she was certain she felt something significant. The question that kept coming up in every language, in every forum, and every late-night conversation across the known systems was the same one. What? Not how. The how was visible on camera. But the why, the actual interior reason that a person with no obligation, no advantage, and full awareness of the odds walks into a situation like that and plants his feet, that was the thing nobody could fully account for, and that was the thing nobody could stop thinking about. Some people tried to answer it clinically. Evolutionary psychology. Threat response. Hardwired protective instinct misfiring outside its intended parameters. The kind of explanation that sounds reasonable and complete until you watch the footage again and specifically watch the moment he sets the bowl down, and the clinical explanation starts to feel like it's describing a different event than the one you're looking at. Others didn't try to explain it at all. They just shared it. Quietly to people they knew with no caption or commentary. Just watch this. Dean Harris was unconscious in a medical bay on Velos Prime for all of this. He had no idea any of it was happening. He was not available for comment. He was not aware that his face had become one of the most recognized faces in the known galaxy over the course of 72 hours. He was not aware that 2 heads of state had sent formal correspondence to the facility. He was not aware that a crowd had gathered outside the building or that his commanding officer was fielding more messages than he had received in his entire career combined. He was just a man in a hospital bed with 18 wounds and a bowl of stew going cold on a wall somewhere in the lower market. And hundreds of millions of people across dozens of worlds were sitting with the footage of what he had done and feeling something that most of them didn't have the right words for but recognized immediately. Something true. Something rare. Something they wanted very badly to believe was real, and that the camera from 17 different angles confirmed absolutely was. The first thing Dean noticed was the ceiling. White. Flat. The particular kind of institutional ceiling that exists in medical facilities across every species and every system, because apparently when you need a ceiling above a recovery bed nobody anywhere in the galaxy gets creative about it. He stared at it for a few seconds while his brain slowly assembled itself back into working order, the gradual process of remembering where he was, what had happened, and why everything from his shoulders to his waist felt like it had been taken apart and put back together by someone working from an incomplete set of instructions. He turned his head slowly to the right. Then he stopped. The room was full. Not in a chaotic way. Nobody was talking loudly or moving around. It was a full room in the quiet sense. Every available space occupied, every chair taken, the particular density of a space that has more people in it than it was designed for, and all of them being very still and very deliberate about it. His brain started processing faces one at a time the way a camera focuses through a crowd. Captain Greg Walsh was standing against the far wall with his arms folded and the expression of a man who had long since passed through surprise, confusion, and mild panic and come out the other side into a kind of exhausted acceptance. Walsh was a practical and unflappable person by nature. 20 years in the Corps had burned most of the flappable out of him, but Dean could see clearly that the last 3 days had tested that quality in ways his career had not previously prepared him for. He had a notepad in one hand that appeared to have nothing written on it, which for Walsh was genuinely unusual. There were 2 medical staff near the equipment on the left wall. A facility administrator Dean didn't recognize standing near the door with a communicator in her hand, looking like she had been managing something complicated and ongoing for quite a while. A few faces he half recognized from the base, people who must have come down to the facility at some point during the 3 days. And then in the corner chair, to his left, sitting with her hands folded in her lap and her back straight and her eyes already on him when he turned, an elderly Dravari woman. She was old in the way that certain people are old, not fragile, not diminished but settled. The kind of old that has weight to it. The silver patterns on her skin that marked Dravari heritage were deep and fully formed in the way they became after a long life, intricate in a way the child's had not yet been. She was dressed simply. She was sitting in the chair with the particular stillness of someone who has been there for a long time and was prepared to be there for considerably longer if necessary. She was watching him with calm, steady eyes. Dean looked around the room one more time. He looked at Walsh. Walsh gave him a slight nod that communicated several things simultaneously. "You're okay, there is a lot to explain, I will explain it, but not right this second." He looked back at the elder. She said something. Quiet, unhurried. Her translator, a small device on the table beside her, processed it a half-beat later in a low, even voice. "You are awake," it said. "Yeah," Dean said. His voice came out rougher than he expected. 3 days without water will do that. Someone appeared immediately at his side with a cup. He drank from it slowly and used the 30 seconds that took to try to get a better handle on what exactly he was looking at. He noticed gradually that there was noise outside the room. Not loud. The facility walls were solid, but present. The low, continuous sound of a crowd that had been there long enough to settle into a patient, waiting kind of quiet. He looked at Walsh again with a question on his face. Walsh said, carefully and without inflection, "There are people outside the building." Dean waited for the rest of that sentence. Walsh added, "Quite a few of them." Dean decided to set that aside for a moment and come back to it. The administrator near the door spoke up gently, explaining that the facility communication system had been operating well above normal capacity for approximately 60 hours. Messages from across 14 star systems, she said, in a tone that suggested she was still not entirely comfortable with that sentence. The system had required additional server support twice. They were still working through the backlog. She said it the way you tell someone their mailbox is full, which was an interesting way to describe what was apparently an interstellar communication event centered on a single hospital room. Walsh cleared his throat. There is also formal correspondence, he said. From two heads of state. Dean looked at him. I know, Walsh said. I know. The elder in the corner chair had been watching this exchange quietly. She had the patience of someone who had waited 72 hours already and was not troubled by a few more minutes. But when Dean looked back at her, she leaned forward slightly and spoke again, and this time the translator took a moment longer than usual, the pause of a device working through something with specific cultural weight. She was my granddaughter, the translation came. The child in the market. She is my daughter's youngest. She had gone ahead in the crowd and we lost sight of her for less than 10 minutes. Dean was quiet. I have sat in this room for 3 days, the elder continued. I was here when they brought you in. I have been here every hour since. She paused. I needed to be present when you opened your eyes. It was important to me that you did not wake up alone. The room was very still. Dean looked at the ceiling for a second, then back at her. He noticed Walsh had uncapped his pen at some point and was holding it over the notepad, apparently prepared to write down whatever happened next, as if a written record might help make sense of the situation. Outside the room the crowd made its low, patient sound. 14 star systems worth of messages sat in a backed-up communication queue. Two heads of state waited for acknowledgement of their correspondence. And Dean Harris lay in his hospital bed in the middle of all of it, trying to remember the last time he had been in a room this full and this quiet at the same time and coming up blank. He looked at the elder. She looked back at him with those calm, steady eyes. Waiting. Not for anything dramatic. Just waiting to see who he was going to be when he woke up, the same way she had been waiting for 3 days. He took a slow breath. Then he asked the only thing that actually mattered to him right now in a voice that was still rough from 3 days of silence, whether the kid was okay. The room stayed quiet after Dean asked about the child. Everyone looked at the elder. She was already nodding slowly before the translator had finished passing the question across. She spoke in a measured, unhurried voice and the translator rendered it a half-beat behind her words. The child was home. She was safe. Not a single injury. She had been returned to her family within the hour of the incident and had been surrounded by people who loved her every moment since. She was sleeping in her own bed, eating her meals, doing the things that small children do when the adults around them have collectively decided to make the world feel as normal as possible. Dean let out a breath. A long one. The kind that has been sitting somewhere in your chest for a while waiting for the right moment to leave. He nodded once. Looked at the ceiling. Nodded again like he was confirming something to himself privately. Good, he said. That was all. Just the one word. But the way he said it made it clear that as far as he was concerned that was the only piece of information in the room that actually mattered and everything else was secondary. Walsh was still standing against the wall with his pen uncapped over the notepad. He had written nothing on it yet. He looked like a man who had prepared extensively for this moment and was now finding that none of his preparation applied. The administrator near the door shifted her weight. Outside the room the low sound of the gathered crowd continued its patient hum. Somewhere further down the facility corridor a door opened and closed. The world kept moving at its regular pace while the room stayed suspended in its particular stillness. The elder looked at Dean for a long moment. Then she spoke again. This time more slowly, choosing each word with the careful deliberateness of someone who understands that what they are about to say carries more weight than ordinary words and wants to make sure it lands correctly. The translator paused slightly longer than usual before speaking. In Dravari culture, it said, there is a word. It is very old. It exists in our oldest texts, in the records kept by the first keepers of memory before the written language was formalized. In all of that time, across every generation, every conflict, every chapter of our history, this word has been spoken aloud in its full and formal meaning 3 times. The room was completely still now. Even the administrator had stopped looking at her communicator. It is not a title, the translator continued. It is not an award or a designation. In our language it is closer to a recognition, an acknowledgement of something true about a person that cannot be given or earned in the ordinary sense. It can only be witnessed. And it can only be spoken by a keeper of memory. She looked directly at Dean. Her eyes were steady and clear and carried the specific gravity of someone about to do something they have thought about for a long time. She said the word. It was not long. 4 syllables in the Dravari language, spoken quietly and without ceremony. The translator did not attempt to render it in standard speech. Some things don't translate, and the device was sophisticated enough to know which ones they were. It simply said, "This word does not have an equivalent. It means approximately, one who is not us, who chose us anyway at cost to themselves without condition." The silence after it was different from the silence before it. Fuller somehow. The kind of silence that follows something that cannot be taken back and that nobody in the room is trying to take back. Dean lay there and received it the way he received most things. Quietly, without performance, looking at the elder with the same straightforward attention he gave everything. Walsh had still not written anything on the notepad. He appeared to have forgotten the notepad existed. Outside the building the crowd had gone quiet too, as if the change in atmosphere inside had somehow passed through the walls. Dean was still for a long moment. Long enough that a few people in the room glanced at each other, not sure what was coming. Then he said, "Is she doing okay though?" The kid. Like actually okay. Sometimes kids seem fine and then it catches up with them later. The elder blinked. The administrator looked up from her communicator. Walsh very slowly lowered his pen. Someone near the back of the room, one of the medical staff, made a small sound that was very close to a laugh that they were clearly trying to suppress. The elder spoke to the translator quietly. It said, "She is genuinely well. She has spoken about what happened. She understood that someone helped her. She has asked several times when she can say thank you." Dean nodded. "Tell her she doesn't have to. She doesn't owe me anything." He paused. Then he said, "Does anyone in this building have coffee? I have been unconscious for 3 days and I cannot deal with any of this without coffee first. That's not negotiable." It landed in the room like a small stone dropped into still water. The ripple moved outward and hit every person in it differently. Walsh made a sound. It started as a cough and became, unmistakably, a laugh. The compressed, exhausted laugh of a man who has been holding an enormous amount of tension for 72 hours and just felt it release all at once. He turned it into a cough again, but nobody was fooled. The administrator was already speaking quietly into her communicator, requesting coffee from the facility kitchen in a tone of profound relief, like this was finally a problem she actually knew how to solve. And the elder, the keeper of memory, the woman who had sat in that corner chair for 3 days and nights without leaving, the woman who had spoken a word used only twice before in the entire recorded history of her people, looked at Dean Harris for one long moment. Then she laughed. It was a real laugh. Deep and genuine and completely unguarded, the kind that comes from somewhere below the composed exterior that grief and age and the weight of an important role build up over years. Her shoulders moved with it. Her eyes creased. It filled the room in a way that changed the temperature of it entirely. Her family, 2 of them standing near the door, adults who had arrived at the facility the previous day, looked at each other with expressions that were equal parts surprise and something much softer than that. One of them said something quietly to the translator. It said, "They want you to know she has not laughed like that in more than 2 years. Since before their loss." Dean looked at her. She was still smiling, settling back from the laugh into something warm and present. He smiled back. Small and genuine and slightly tired around the edges. Outside the building the crowd was waiting for something historic. The reporters had their equipment ready. 4 government representatives had formal statements to collect. Historians would later note that this was a moment that crossed cultural lines in ways that took years to fully understand. The morning a human soldier woke up to find the galaxy had been watching him, and responded by asking for coffee. No speech. No declaration. No carefully chosen words about duty or sacrifice or the bonds between species. Just a man in a hospital bed who wanted to know if a child was really okay, who received one of the rarest honors in galactic history and then asked about hot drinks, and who made an old woman laugh for the first time in 2 years without trying to do anything except be exactly who he was. The coffee arrived 6 minutes later. Dean drank it slowly in a room full of people who had come from across 14 star systems to be there for this moment and found, to their complete surprise, that the moment was nothing like they had expected. It was better. Quieter and warmer and more human than anything they had prepared for, and somehow, in all the ways that actually mattered, exactly right.